That was a 62. That was a 62. Please. One shot. Let's go. Yo guys, what is up? Max for a Diablo 4 video, and today we are going over my updated Hammer of the Ancients build guide. Now, I posted this video back at like level 80. We were hitting for 10 mil. I'm using some different damage multipliers. We've updated and changed our Paragon board. I've got a better understanding of the build, and we're now hitting for 67 million. This build is fantastic for Nightmare Dungeons. We are two-shotting Nightmare Dungeon bosses, and today we're going to be going over absolutely everything you need to know. Now, real quick, before we get into the build video, I do have an announcement. This video is sponsored by me. My friends and I, we have put together our own website dedicated for builds for Diablo 4. You can find this full build as well as like a written guide on dpscheck.gg. That is going to be our website. A lot of effort has gone into this, so I hope you guys check out the website. But I will be going over everything you need to know in this build video. Let's get into it. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of the video, I just want to explain something real quick. Now, Hammer of the Ancients works differently than a lot of other skills on the Barbarian, in that it's going to deal 1% additional damage for each point of fury you had when using it. This means that one of the best ways to scale your damage with Hammer of the Ancients is gear that's giving us additional fury, and you're going to see that across my gear, across my Paragon board. That is probably the biggest difference in terms of gearing and speccing for Hammer of the Ancients versus any other Barbarian build, is that additive fury is going to give you so much more damage. And if you're looking to really push the damage of this build, you're going to be looking for more fury in all the places that you can get it, and I'm going to be showing you exactly how to do that. The other thing that's really important for this build is that we're going to be berserking. Now, because Hammer of the Ancients is by default a bludgeoning skill, that means it will be using the two-handed mace expertise. The two-handed mace expertise, when we lucky hit, we have a chance to gain fury and double that while berserking. The more fury we have when we cast Hammer of the Ancients, the more damage that'll deal, and we have increased critical strike damage to stun and vulnerable enemies while berserking. So berserking is very, very important for us. In our expertise slot or our technique slot, we're going to be using the two-handed axe. The way that this expertise system, I've explained it before, but the way that this works is in this technique slot, you can slot an expertise that you benefit from without actually having to use that kind of weapon. Now let's talk gear. We're going to be going over each legendary aspect for each slot and the priorities that you're looking for. Now, on your helmet for a Hammer of the Ancients build, the #1 priority is maximum fury. I actually have quite a low roll here, so I'm missing out on like another 7% increased damage, unfortunately, but max fury is the best thing you're looking for. Cooldown reduction is great, and then I've also got damage while berserking, which is fantastic, and increased life. This is pretty much a perfect helmet for me. Other things that you could look for are increased strength, which would also be nice, and we're using the aspect of disobedience. This stacks up, giving us increased armor, which is going to give us increased damage reduction, which is just fantastic. Best defensive aspect in the entire game. Next up, we're using a chest piece. Now, we are not going to be using the Haragoth chest piece because it only resets the cooldowns of your non-ultimate skills on inherent bleed skills. A Hammer of the Ancients does not inherently proc a bleed, so you cannot use that chest piece. Instead, we're going to be looking for a high damage reduction chest piece. This one is still the best chest piece. I got it at level 64. I could get up to +4 ranks of challenging shot, which would be fantastic. I haven't seen that yet, but you're looking for damage reduction, two things that you're going to be in contact with. So for example, damage reduction from distant enemies is not as good as damage reduction from close, and damage reduction from bleeding, which is basically going to be everything that we're fighting. And then you can get percentage increased damage on your chest piece, which is really good, and ranks of challenging shot. This is basically my perfect rolled chest piece. However, I just need to get that +4 on challenging. For our legendary aspect, we're going to be damaging an enemy with a core skill as a chance to extend the duration of berserking. We already went over how important berserking is, and we're going to be dealing more damage while we're berserking dramatically. So extending berserking is really important. With our current setup, our shouts are up most of the time, but just to have that 100% uptime, I do like this aspect. Next up, for our gloves, the number one priority on your gloves is obviously +4 ranks of Hammers of the Ancients, and then right after that is crit chance. If you can roll double crit chance, that's fantastic. Lucky hit chance is also really nice on your gloves. I've got crit chance against injured and base crit strike chance and Hammer of the Ancients. And then on our gloves, we're going to be using the stun multiplier for dealing more damage to stunned enemies. I don't have a perfect roll of this, but up to 40% increased damage to stun, and we're basically going to be always stunning enemies. So that's really great. Next up, we are not using the Temerity Pants on this build. I messed around with it. Temerity Pants just don't feel very good on this build because we're not going to be constantly spinning, where we're constantly healing. We're not healing as much on this build. We are going to be going for a lot more damage reduction, and you can get so much damage reduction on your pants. So I've got damage reduction while fortified, damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding, and damage reduction from close, and +4 ranks of Warcry. These are pretty perfect plants. You can get so much DR on them. And for Warcry, that is the skill that's going to give us increased damage, which is perfect for Hammer of the Ancients because we're going to be trying to hit as hard as we possibly can. I am using the aspect each point of Fury generated while at max Fury grants Fortify. Now, this is where we get to one of our first big changes of the build, and that is we are not going to be using the damage while you have a barrier active. If we're not using the Temerity Pants, I was thinking about using a barrier pant with, like, we would still just use the aspect where we get barrier, but it only procs once every 30 seconds. And in Nightmare Dungeons, I was getting like 5k barrier, which just instantly goes away. It just didn't feel good. And we're going to have more damage while we're fortified and a ton of damage reduction while fortified. So on our Hammer of the Ancients version of this, compared to my Whirlwind build, we are going to be looking for a lot more damage reduction while fortified. Now, one thing to note is this is only active when we are fully fortified, aka our Fortify equals our health bar. One thing, if you did not know, is Fortify is not subtracted from your health bar before your health. They are subtracted equally. So you're only benefiting from Fortify when you're fully fortified. With this build, we're fortified all the time, and we're going to be getting a ton of damage reduction and increased damage when we are fortified. Next up on our boots, the number one thing that you can roll for on your boots for this build is Fury cost reduction. The next thing after that is Berserking duration, and then movement speed is really nice to have. I didn't roll good movement speed on these, unfortunately, but Berserking duration is going to give us more damage uptime, and Fury cost reduction is going to help dramatically with spamming our hammers. Next up, we get to our weapons. Now, I'm actually missing some really important rolls for my weapons. So that's 67 mil that we could hit if I get a god roll. Hammer, I think we could easily get into the 70s and possibly 80s. On your weapons, in order of priority, you're looking at number 1 priority is vulnerable damage. Number 2 priority is crit damage. Number 3 priority is either core or strength. Note that I don't have core on this and I don't have vulnerable damage, so I'm actually using not a very good hammer. Like, this could be so much better. I've got the crit damage, damage to slowed, damage to close, and strength. We'll talk about that damage to slowed in a second because I had to make a slight tweak to my specific build because I had this rolled on my hammer. But genuinely, like, I think with a little bit more maxing, min-maxing, I wanted to get this build video, but I think we could get into the 70s, no issue. But yeah, that is my hammer, and we're using the Hammer of the Ancient Quakes Outwards, dealing a percentage of its damage to enemies. Now, this seems a little iffy. When you hit with Hammer of the Ancients, I looked through all of my footage, and 99% of the time, when I'm hitting an enemy to like 3 o'clock, to my like, basically to my sides, I'm dealing way more damage. I wasn't noticing like as consistently damage to enemies that were behind me, but enemies to the side of me were taking dramatically more damage. The enemy that I hit for 67 mil was to the side of me. So when you're trying to line these up, you want to line up basically whatever target you want to kill to the side of you. It's a lot easier on mouse and keyboard. Controller, you just got to like aim the analog stick which way you would like to hit. Next up for our swords, crit damage, close damage, core skill, vulnerable. just missing the strength roll here, but that's fine. We're using the aspect of Berserk Ripping. Now, this is where we're getting bleed. We still need to be doing bleed with this build. We cannot afford to go absolutely zero bleed, maybe like primarily because of the disembowel glyph. But this is going to give enemies bleeding on them, and enemies actually bleed for a decent bit on this build. This is more so of a utility thing than damage, but that is what we're rocking on our sword. Next up, this is a big change to the build. Now, instead of using the increased damage while we have a barrier, we're going to be using Ground Stomp. Gives us an earthquake, and while standing in earthquakes, we deal 15% increased damage. As soon as I put on this Ground Stomp, I noticed my damage spiked dramatically. I went from hitting 19 mils to hitting 30 mils and 45 mils. This is a ton of damage. It seems like it's not. I don't know if this is like doing more damage than it should, but this gave me a dramatic damage boost, and we're going to be using the Ground Stomp skill. We're no longer using a basic skill. I'll talk about that once we get to our skill tree, but Ground Stomp makes this build feel so much better. And then lastly, on our two-handed sword, we've got core skill, vulnerable, crit damage, strength. This is pretty much a perfect rolled sword, and we're using the aspect of Limit Rage, which is going to give our core skills more damage when we have more fury, which works perfectly with the Hammer of the Ancients. Next up for rings. Now, rings you're going to want to shift on Hammer of the Ancients builds to Max Fury. Max Fury is going to give you a ton of damage. In order of priority, Vulnerable is still a higher priority in my opinion, but Vulnerable and then Max Fury, crit chance, crit damage, all really good things. I've got pretty much double perfect rings here, which is fantastic. Part of the reason I'm able to hit so much. For our shouts, if you do not have a Bold Chieftain's aspect, I do not recommend trying the Ground Stomp version of this. You're not going to be able to keep up your shouts and keep up your damage. So I'll talk more about like a budget setup for this. But Bold Chieftains gives us the ability to basically keep up our shouts all the time. And we need our shouts all the time because we're not going to be using a resource generator. Next up, your shouts generate more fury per second. Still haven't found a max roll for this, but it would give us even more damage if I did. And then lastly, for your amulet, #1 priorities are fury cost reduction and cooldown. If you can get plus into all of your defensive skills, that is fantastic. If you can get plus into Wallop, that's really great. If you can get plus into Heavy-Handed, that's really great. If you can get plus into Pit Fighter or Counter-Offensive, that's all really great. This is the best amulet that I've found. It's got double roll damage reduction, so we are really, really tanky on this build. And then we're going to be using the Edge Master's aspect for our skills to deal increased damage whenever we have primary resource. Note that the ability to output a ton of damage on this build is super reliant on our ability to generate a ton of resource and have a lot of increased fury to deal the most damage. Now let's go over our skill tree. And one thing to note is this skill tree that I'm going to be showing you is for if you've got some gear, if you've got some Paragon points, if you're starting out on Barbarian, if you're under level 60, under level 70, I would still strongly recommend watching that original Hammer of the Ancients guide. This skill tree that I'm going to be showing you, you're going to need to have decent fury costs. You're going to need to have some min-max rolls to be able to output this amount of damage and make this setup work. But once you do, this does absurd damage. So to start us off, you can put these 2 points wherever you want. We are just putting them in Lunging Strike to get down to our next thing. The basic skill that you put here does not matter because we're not using a basic skill. Next up, Hammer of the Ancients, and obviously Furious Hammer of the Ancients is going to give us increased damage. Now, we are not using the pressure point, mainly because most things don't live past the vulnerable state. We are killing bosses in Nightmare Dungeons, High Nightmare Dungeons in around 2 hits. So if you are struggling in your damage, you grab pressure point, but most things are dead while they're vulnerable, so I haven't had an issue with that yet. Next up, we get into our defensive skills. Now, the big one here is Ground Stomp. Ground Stomp is going to stun enemies for 3 seconds, giving us a... oh, sorry, it's 5 seconds of stun. My bad. It's got 5 seconds of stun, which is plenty of time to delete things, and it reduces the cooldown of our ultimate skill by 1 second for each enemy damaged by Ground Stomp. We're going to be talking about Wrath of the Berserker in a second, but Wrath of the Berserker is how we're going to be able to hit so much damage, and having way more uptime on it, we were chunking off like 12, 15 seconds just spamming this, is really, really nice. Next up, Rallying Cry. It's going to give us more resource generation. Perfect skill for this build because we need as much resource generation as we can get to do as much damage. Challenging shout with tactical challenging shout, so that we're going to be getting more fury. We've got ranks into Warcry. It's going to give us berserking. It's going to give us a ton more damage. Next up, we're going over to Booming Voice and Raid Leader. I still love this skill. Our shouts are going to be yelling us for 9% all the time, always active. It's fantastic. We're always going to be berserking. Berserking is going to give us more fury generation. This is going to help a ton with basically keeping up our fury at all times. Next, I grabbed Pit Fighter. I'm dealing increased damage to close enemies and distant damage reduction. Note that I did put 1 point into Hamstring. Now, this is specific to my build. And what I mean by that is I have a random damage to slowed on my gear that I wouldn't normally have. So I had to put this point into Hamstring in order to take advantage of that damage multiplier on my weapon. But ideally, I wouldn't have this point here. And then you could put this point into things like No Mercy, where you get increased crit chance against stunned enemies, which would be really, really nice. But this 1 point you could toss anywhere. It's kind of a bit of a throwaway point. I just needed it to slow enemies down for my specific weapon. Then we come over to Counter Offensive. While you have Fortify, you deal increased damage. We're going to always have Fortify up. Then we come over down here to Heavy Handed. Let me open this back up. Down to Heavy Handed, increased crit damage with two-handed weapons, perfect for us. Wallop is fantastic. We're just going to deal increased damage to vulnerable or stunned enemies while using bludgeoning weapons. Concussion is going to give us that chance to stun. Note that this isn't necessary, mainly because we can just delete things without having to stun them because we're using Ground Stomp. So we're not relying on Concussion anymore for our stun. So if you wanted to take these points out, if you're feeling like you need a little bit more survivability, I would take these points out from Concussion and put them into Invigorating Fury. This is going to give us even more healing and sustain. Concussion gives us a little bit more stun uptime, so that's why I got that there. But you could put these 3 points in either. For most damage, I'd recommend Concussion. Then I actually put 3 points into Tempered Fury. I know this looks dumb, but it's 9 more Fury. That's 9% more damage for our Hammer of the Ancients, so that's why I grabbed it. Now we get into Wrath of the Berserker. Now, Wrath of the Berserker reads, while Wrath of the Berserker is active, every 50 Fury you spend increases Berserk's damage bonus by 25%. Note that currently, with my Hammer of the Ancients, I'm spending 51 Fury cost. Now, with our setup, the way that you want to do this, and I'll go over like a specific combo, but the way that you want to do this is you're going to want to proc your 3 shouts. So you are like damage rotation now is you proc your 3 shouts. You're going to be genning Fury like crazy. And then you're going to want to start smacking enemies. This is going to sound weird, that are not the ones that you want to kill. So you're basically going to be spending as much Fury as you can, spamming your Hammer of the Ancients on enemies that are not the elites and not the focus, not the boss. Every time you swing your hammer, you're going to be getting 25% more damage. You've got, what is it, like 5 seconds of this, 5 seconds of uptime. And during that time, as if you've got a good Fury regen, you can spam this up, get this multiplier to a dramatically high number, and then as soon as you're ready, boom, Ground Stomp so that they're stunned, and then swing your Hammer of the Ancients on the elite, and ideally to this side. That's kind of like the ideal rotation. Now let's go over my Paragon board, and I've made some pretty drastic changes to my board in order to improve our damage, improve our survivability, and the 2 main big new things are the Hemorrhage board and the Flawless Technique board. Now, we went up into the Hemorrhage board, and the reason I picked this board is because it's got a ton of dexterity nodes around where I'm going to plan to socket the Wrathglyph. This is going to give me a ton of crit damage with my core skills. This was one of the biggest damage spikes I noticed for the build. It's got some nice things like damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding, which are great. This dot stuff we don't care about too much, but we're here mainly because it's a quick in and out exit where we can get in, get our glyph, and get out, and it's got the most dexterity around it from the other things. Then we're leaving that board and going up into the Flawless Technique board, which also has a bunch of willpower around it, where we're able to pick up a ton of damage reduction from close, which is really nice, and socket the Imbiber glyph. Now, Imbiber is going to give us 60% damage while healthy. Note that this is only like what level is this thing? It's only level 15, so this will go up dramatically. You could either go for the damage while healthy or damage while fortified. I went damage while healthy because I'm pretty much always healthy. I'm fortified most of the time, but I'm always healthy. So that is why I went for this glyph, and we're able to get a ton more damage here. So in our Paragon board, for like the full thing real quick, we're down here. We're putting exploit in the first slot. That's going to give us our guaranteed vulnerable and our increased vulnerable damage. In our next board, we've got the weapons master board. We're going to grab a bunch more damage, and I actually moved the disembowel glyph to this board. Now, the reason I moved disembowel over from this side where it originally was is because the martial glyph grants 100% bonus to all magic nodes within range, and when it was socketed here, I was getting more armor, I was getting some more willpower, I was getting some more dex. It just like wasn't all that impressive. However, if we move the martial glyph into the decimator board, then it gives us all these bigger bonuses. We get double bonuses to all of our vulnerable damage. So now I'm getting a bunch more vulnerable damage, more damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, and some more willpower, which is really, really, really nice. So the disembowel glyph here, we don't really care about the dot damage. We're just here for killing an enemy, has a chance to reduce our cooldowns. Really, really important. Martial is going to give us a ton more vulnerable and more cooldowns on our shouts. Then we're going up into the Warbringer. This is the most important build or board for Hoda. It's going to give us a bunch more maximum fury. You really want to hit these willpower requirements for the plus 16 fury there and the plus 16 fury here. Super important to reach those willpower requirements because more maximum fury is just more damage. Then we've got the territorial board with 39 and 25 dexterity for 64% more damage to close enemies. And that is kind of the Paragon setup. I think this is just about as good as I can get, and I'm going to be swapping to this for my Whirlwind as well. One thing with the Whirlwind is I'll probably put some more points up into here to get more bleed damage and damage to bleeding enemies. We don't really care about that too much for Hoda, but yes, really, really good Paragon setup. Guys, that is going to do it for the build video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. Apologies that my eyes are so red. It's currently 4 a.m. where I'm recording this. Hammer of the Ancients is a fantastic build, and I prefer it so much more for doing nightmare dungeons. If you are trying to level up your character as fast as possible, I still recommend Whirlwind. Whirlwind is the skill that I think you should be using from like level 50 to level like 75 or 80. And then for pushing nightmare dungeons, if you're into that, Hoda is just so gross for deleting nightmare dungeons. I still think Whirlwind has better clear speed, but for nightmare dungeons past 60, this is definitely the good setup to check out. Guys, that is it for the video. I will catch y'all in the next one. Take care, guys. Peace.